Good morning. We look today at Romans, Matthew 14, verses 22 through 35, 36, the end of the chapter. And remember yesterday we had just seen Jesus feed 5,000 men, plus the women and the children. And right after that, right after the disciples had gathered up the remains of what was left over, he told them to get into a boat to head over to the other side of the sea while he dispersed the crowds. And that was what the disciples had wanted Jesus to do, before the meal, was to send the crowds home. But somehow, when Jesus said that to the crowds, to disperse them, to encourage them to go find a place to stay or whatever, they did. As the disciples went in the boat, and as Jesus, it says, went up on the mountain to pray, to be by himself, to carve out some of that alone time. And then it says, Matthew writes, when evening came. Well, I always pictured this feeding of the 5,000, kind of as to, later in the day, around, 5, 6 o'clock, when we would normally eat, our afternoon meal. And but whatever. But it says when evening came. Jesus was up on the mountain. The boat with the disciples was quite a ways out into the sea. It says, several, you can look different places. It says several stadia or whatever. That's about 1/8 of a mile. So it was, out in the middle of the sea. And it says the wind was against them. And we know in North Dakota what it is like to be with the wind against you. Think about when you're driving someplace and the wind's blowing 25, 30, 40 miles an hour, or even 20 miles an hour, and you go by a shelter belt on one side of the road, and you come out, and what happens? The wind hits you and pushes you around, and we know what the wind does with the snow, and sometimes with the dirt in the fields in the summertime. We know what it is to have the wind against us. And even just to go out and walk, on the roads, if you're walking into the wind, especially this time of the year, it's cold and biting, and you turn your back on it, and the wind pushes you a little bit, but it's still, it has a lot of effect, that wind does. But the wind was against them, it says, and the disciples were I'm sure that they were a little bit wondering about what was going on. Many of them experienced fishermen. They'd been on the sea, but not in the middle of the night. The fishermen usually went out. Well, I guess a lot of them did go out. They did night fishing. They'd go out late in the evening and fish through the night and then come in the morning. But they usually were pretty close to shore. But here they're out in the middle of the sea. And Jesus comes walking across the water. Now, if that happened to you or me, if we were someplace, way out in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden, boom, there's somebody right there, we'd be a little bit terrified too. And that's what Matthew says the disciples were. He was one of them. He would know. But Jesus says to them, take heart. It is I. Don't be afraid. When they realize that something is there on the water, Jesus calms their fears and says, it's me. He was coming to them out in the middle of nowhere, in a time of trouble, in a time of need, in a time when they were probably pretty tired from battling the wind and the waves. And Jesus says, it's me, it's okay. And Peter, the story says, if it's you, Lord, tell me to come to you. Command me to come to you. And Jesus does. He says, come. And Peter gets out of the boat and starts to walk across the water. And, here in North Dakota in the wintertime, we can walk across the water when it's frozen, but yet there's still, the ice isn't always safe. We see and hear reports of pickups and four-wheelers and different things going through the ice, and we see people going through the ice as well, just walking on the water, on the ice. But Peter is doing okay as long as he's looking at Jesus, as long as his focus is on Jesus. And then he looks down and he sees that he's on the water and there's nothing solid underneath him, and he gets scared and starts to sink. I've never been at a place where they have, way up high, 15 floors off the ground, where they have a glass walkway where you can stand on this glass and look straight down, or that would be pretty scary, to be there and to realize you're just standing on this piece of glass. But Peter was on the sea, and the sea wasn't just calm. I mean, remember, there was wind blowing and the waves were going, and somehow Peter was walking above the water just as Jesus was. But when he realized that wasn't possible, he started to sink. And you think about that. When Peter was focused on Jesus, he was okay. He was on top of the water and things were going good. And then when he realized where he was, his helplessness, his inability to do that, he began to sink, began to fail. And I think that's a good model for us in our lives too. When we focus on God, when we focus on Jesus, when we have our focus on the good things, when we have a positive outlook on life, it makes such a difference. Such a difference, when we focus on the good things. If we focus on the negatives of life, we find ourselves, depressed and down and, the old woe is me type deal, But so when Peter was focused on Jesus, things were going okay. And I take a message from that for myself as well, that, to keep my focus on Jesus, to keep my focus on the good things, and to remember that in and through all things, Jesus walks alongside of me and is there for me. And you've probably read this as well. There was a man going on a journey, and he had to walk across this narrow bridge, and he prayed and he said, God, let me take your hand. And God says, no, I will take your hand because I won't let go. You might get scared and let go. And when we place ourselves in God's hands, it's just better for us. It just really and truly is. And so we go back to Matthew here, and Peter is walking on the water, and then all of a sudden starts to sink, and he cries out, Lord, help me. And Jesus reaches out and takes his hand. And immediately, they got into the boat. They got into the boat, and the wind ceased, and the waves were calm. And, this is a reminder too that, Jesus will help us remain calm, be able to focus, maybe I should say, in the storms of our lives. And we all have storms in our lives. We do. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that goes on in our lives that we can't always handle on our own. And this gospel text, I think I've shared with you before, that was the text that I preached on in my home church in McHenry, many years ago, probably close to 30 years ago now. And when I got to that point that I said, if I'd have been Peter going to step out of the boat, I'd have hung on, and I grabbed the top of the pulpit in my hand, and I kind of stepped aside, and that top of the pulpit wasn't fastened. It just came right off in my hands. It was just sitting there. And I remember saying, well, so much for the security in that. And that's true for a lot of things in life. We put our trust in some things that we shouldn't. And sometimes the things that we think are secure, sometimes we think the things that will, never fail us, never let us down, do. And sometimes those things are people. Sometimes those things are vehicles or whatever it might be. But, it's still, again, that reminder that, the things in this life, the things in this world, we can't always count 100% on. But Jesus, God, yeah, we can count on them. And put our trust in them. And when we get to those points in our lives, when we have that struggle, like Peter, we get down on our knees and we pray and we say, Lord, help me. We do. I've done that, I don't know how many times. More times than I could count, for sure. But we reach out for God in our times of trouble. And the end of this chapter, the boat gets to the land of Gennesaret. And it says that after the people of that place recognized him, they sent word throughout the region, and all came to see him and to hear him. And they brought all of the sick to them. And they begged that they might even just touch his cloak, that they might be healed, and many of them were. And you think about that faith. You think about those people reaching out to Jesus, because that's what they did. They came and they reached out to Jesus, knowing that he would be able to help them. And that's what we do. I mean, we reach out to Jesus, and we, in our times of trouble, in our times of despair, when we're sick, when we're lonely, when we're hurt, we reach out for Jesus. And the power of Jesus is there, his love and his healing. And, it's just a reminder that things go better when we have God in our lives that way. So, as you go through this day, when you reach the places of troubled water, when you have some concerns in your life, don't be afraid to ask Jesus to step in and help. Don't be afraid to say, Jesus, Lord, help me. Take a lesson from Peter. When you know you're in over your head, reach out to the one who can save you from it all.